RedditHub. March 2, 1978. An old woman lay in bed, but she couldn't sleep. Something in her chest felt off. A dull ache. Shallow little breaths made her worn-out heart feel like it was dancing wildly inside her ribcage. And when the pain became a vile burn that felt like it was going to tear her in two, she opened her eyes wide as she tried to sit up, but she couldn't see. Only darkness, the weight of the shabby blanket, smothering her fragile body like a bag of bricks, the faint sound of somebody mumbling in the room next door. She tried to call out for a nurse, but nobody came. They often didn't. There were far too many cries for help in that place. Far too many. So many, over time, they just became background noise, a kind of infrasound the human ear could no longer pick up. In the morning, an orderly finally came and peeked her head through the door. "Good morning, Mary," she said, but she got no reply. She moved on to the next room. "Good morning, Rose." Going through the motions. She had been in this job for so many years, she did this on autopilot. But this time, something made her backpedal and walk back to Mary's room. "Good morning, Mary," she repeated, but only the birds singing outside echoed her greeting. Annoyed, she slowly walked up to the lump on the narrow cast-iron bed where Mary's blind, lifeless eyes stared sadly back at her. She furrowed her brow, pulled the thin white sheet up to cover the old woman's face, and briskly walked back into the corridor to notify her superintendent. She knew nobody would cry over Mary, but she had to. It was her job. She had no known relatives. Her remains were shipped to a funeral home after a short stint in the nursing home's morgue. From home to home, yet Mary hadn't known home in decades. The undertaker cremated her and poured her ashes into a simple, coffee can-like urn. He stored it in a dingy, unlit back room and called the local paper to have her obituary published, as he always did. All of this was routine. He knew nobody would care to read those few lines, but it didn't matter. He had to honor that routine. It was his job. At the Bloomington Pantagraph, a columnist picked up the phone. His name was Rick Baker. He was working on another piece, and he had trouble hiding his frustration when he realized he had been called for yet another obituary. As a journalist, obituaries are one of the most mind-numbing things you'll ever have to write. Something to do with paying one last homage to someone you never met, and who might have been a total for all you know. And for all you care. Baker quickly scanned the room for an apprentice he could dump this task on, but as he weighed his options, he raised his eyebrows at the receiver nestled between his shoulder and the side of his head. In his dull voice, the mortician was reciting the facts. Or the lack thereof. Mary Dofour died in the early hours of March 2, 1978, at the Queenwood East Nursing Home in Morton, a small town southeast of Peoria, Illinois. A heart attack. She was probably in her 70s or 80s. Probably, because the truth is that nobody knew when exactly Mary had been born. Or where. Or to whom. Actually, nobody even knew her real name. Mary Dofour was an alias she had been given when she first was institutionalized. Dofour was not an unusual spelling of a French name, but a contraction of Do plus the number 4. Meaning she was the fourth Jane Doe to turn up at a mental hospital without an ID or even a name she could call her own. And that's it. That's all they had on Mary. A death date, but no birth date. A face, but not a name. People who knew her well in her final years, but nobody who knew her before she essentially became a number on state records. Baker stared at his notes as he put the receiver down. 2 lines were all he had to work with. Shoot. This was going to be the lousiest obituary he had ever written. The apprentice was nowhere to be found. So he draped his jacket over his shoulders and headed out. At Queenwood East, he sought out the staff that had cared for Mary. They confirmed what the funeral home clerk had told him on the phone. Mary was a glitch in the matrix. She had turned up catatonic in northern Illinois in the late 1920s. Attempting to walk down a country road, it seemed. She couldn't remember her name nor where she came from. Medical exams showed that she had been beaten and raped. But she couldn't tell the hospital staff exactly how or when it happened. She was also pregnant. Despite the trauma, Mary soon regained her lucidity, even if she never remembered who she was. She was described as level-headed, articulate, and intelligent. She was in her mid-20s, had bright blue eyes, naturally curly light brown hair, high cheekbones, and a full round face. How she had come to grief in such a place is a mystery. But surprisingly, Mary was never offered the support she needed to help her remember who she used to be. As soon as she gave birth, her child was snatched from her even before she could hold it. Presumably dumped at an unnamed orphanage. She never got to name it. She never even knew if she birthed a boy or a girl. Mary's attempts to convince staff that she wasn't crazy and that she desperately needed help so she could get back on her feet were met with eye rolls and frustrated sighs. As she became more and more insistent, she was force-fed pills and other concoctions to keep her calm. When that wasn't enough, she was stripped naked, restrained, wheeled into a theater, and given electroconvulsive therapy, painful and powerful shocks to her brain administered via electrodes. Sometimes the shocks were so powerful they knocked her out. When that happened, the wires were ripped from her scalp, and she was dumped on a large tub filled with freezing water, the protocol to revive patients at the Bartonville State Hospital. The once bright and inquisitive Mary Dofour slowly but surely began to slide down the slippery slope of stupor. Her body was kept alive, but the aggressive treatment didn't fail to turn her into an orderly, docile vegetable at a hospital for the criminally insane. Her only crime? Being a victim. But before Mary began to lose her reason, she was able to recall certain details from her past life. She thought she had previously worked as an elementary school teacher, possibly first or second grade. She could distinctly remember working with young children. She was literate, unusually well-read, she liked to talk, and she could be funny. But nobody cared to listen. And nobody bothered to dig further into Mary's past. In the early 1930s, there were far too many Mary Does, and the protocol was to lock them up and away from the public eye. They were a nuisance. At Bartonville, Mary was assigned a tiny room with no toilet. There was one nurse for each 150 patients, and Mary's cries for help went unanswered when she needed to use the loo, which meant she had to defecate on the floor. When she was allowed to use a proper toilet, there was no sink, so Mary tried to wash herself using toilet bowl water. Any patient who protested the inhuman treatment was wheeled into the electroconvulsive therapy theater. Mary lived in Bartonville for 30 years until the facility closed. She never had a visitor, and the powerful medication and treatments she was subjected to made her amnesia permanent. When Bartonville closed, Mary was shipped from one nursing home to the other until she ended up at Queenwood East, where she met her end. She had previously gone blind, approximately a year prior. Rick Baker put her file down and realized he had forgotten to breathe. Not only did he now have enough material to write this piece, but he also had the faint hope that Mary's horrific story, when published on the Pantograph, which had a decent circulation of about 50,000 copies, could reach somebody who knew the unknown woman. Sadly, he didn't have a picture to go with it. The nursing home had never bothered to take one. While he couldn't do anything to change the poor woman's tragic fate, he could at least use his audience to give her a name. Little did he know that uncovering Mary Dofour's true identity would become a life's worth of work. Baker had managed to compile a 14-page account of Mary's horrific story, and he published it on March 12, 10 days after Mary's passing. He was on a race against the clock. If nobody claimed Mary's remains, she would be given a pauper's funeral by the state. Baker anxiously checked the Pantograph's mailbox every morning as he arrived at the news desk, but no letters ever came. The phone never rang. Nobody within the Pantograph's reach, in Bloomington and beyond, seemed to know of a school teacher who vanished in the 1920s, some 55 years prior, and who could possibly match the few facts he had been able to gather from a mix and match of institutional records. Months passed. Baker decided to change jobs. As he flipped through his notes fishing for his best stories so he could mail them to the much broader reach Peoria Journal-Star, the Mary Dofour clipping fell out of his file. He gave it another read and slipped it into his application envelope without a second thought. It was hardly newsworthy as it was, but he was secretly proud of the work he had done, especially considering how little he had to work with. Baker was hired in January of 1979, 9 months after Mary's death. As he sat at his brand new desk at Peoria Journal-Star, only a few weeks after he had started, his managing editor paid him a visit. He sat on his desk and placed Mary Dufour's clipping on top of his typewriter. "You know this story about the unknown woman who died in Morton? I wonder if you could get to the bottom of it," he said tentatively. Without a name and without a face, Mary was a ghost that only occasionally haunted his thoughts. Baker was ready to politely decline the offer. But gladly, he didn't. And so he called up the mortician, in hopes that someone might have claimed the ashes over the past year. If he could get a hold of their name and how they knew Mary, it would be a sweet ending to his previous story. Or at least, as much of a happy ending for Mary as he could give her. But the mortician, Robert Perry, had received no inquiries besides Baker's. He knew he had published the story, so he had kept Mary's ashes in his back room, in hopes one day someone might turn up. But the law stated that he would have to bury them by the end of the month. Baker used this as an angle to republish his story on the Peoria Star. It was his last desperate attempt to have someone come forward. Someone who could properly mourn Mary as the rest of her was returned to the earth. Someone who could put a real name and birth date on her gravestone. The Peoria Journal-Star had a much wider reach than the Bloomington Pantagraph, with an almost 100,000 circulation. His story was equally reprinted in papers all over the Midwest, all the way to Chicago. And Baker went back to checking his mailbox every morning. Eagerly, anxiously, hopefully. 2 days later, he received 2 letters with the clipping attached. The first was from a woman who just wanted to say how horrifying this story was and how it had personally affected her. The second was from someone complaining about the paper's poor printing. Both ended up in Baker's trash can. The third letter only came sometime later, with an Iowa stamp. Like the first 2, it came with a Chicago Tribune clipping. It was from a woman who had lived in Mount Vernon, Iowa, in the 1920s. The words, "missing school teacher," rang a bell. A young school teacher had gone missing from the area in the 1930s, she wrote. She thought her name was Alice Zeisser. Or Caesar. She didn't remember because she barely knew her. Alice was described as young and bright, and her disappearance was entirely out of character. Despite some local publicity back in the day, Alice never turned up. Rumors said she was seen hopping on a train one day, and never came back. That's all. That's all the Iowa woman knew about Alice. No other letters came. Baker was understandably annoyed. The lead couldn't be vaguer, and the woman confirmed on the phone that this was all she had. 50 years had passed. Her memory was not what it used to be. Baker called a grade school in Mount Vernon and asked if there was any local lore about a school teacher who had gone missing 5 decades ago. The secretary who picked up the phone laughed and said she had no clue. Baker insisted. She told him she would ask around to get rid of him. Baker dropped the Mary Dufour story. He was damn sure he would never hear back from Mount Vernon. He was wrong. A few days later, his phone rang, and he was surprised to hear the secretary's voice at the other end of the line. She said she had brought up the tale with older employees, and there was indeed a story about an Alice going missing 50 years prior. It turns out that her name might have been Alice Caesar, and she had even managed to get her hands on an acquaintance's phone number. Baker dialed it and found himself talking to a retired banker from the Lisbon, Mount Vernon area. His name was Harry. Harry wasn't happy to hear that Baker, a reporter from Peoria, had decided to bother an old man with a 50-year-old story. He listened as Baker excitedly laid out the details: a beautiful young woman, possibly an elementary school teacher who had gone missing in the 1930s. Blue eyes, brown curly hair. Intelligent, bright. Something awful happens one day, and she's raped and beaten, turns up amnesic near Chicago. She is then cruelly committed to a mental institution against her will, where the men in the white coats proceed to pump all kinds of drugs into her system and fry her brain with electric shocks. She goes on to live 50 years a Jane Doe and dies alone. Silence. Harry scoffed. Yes, he knew of a school teacher from the area that fit that description. But her name wasn't Alice. Her name was Anna Merle Sizer, not Caesar or Zeiser. But Anna Merle couldn't have ended up in a mental institution, fading away in agony for 50-odd years. Merle, as everyone knew her, had been murdered sometime in the fall of 1926. Baker was understandably disappointed. But he was a reporter. He had a sixth sense. He decided to push further. Was there a record of Merle's murder? No, there wasn't. Who murdered her, and why? Harry didn't know. It turns out that the murder hypothesis was just that, Harry's theory. The one he had believed for the past 5 decades. Merle was a Cornell college dropout who worked as a school teacher to save money so she could go back to college. She was attractive, she was in her late 20s, she had blue eyes and naturally curly brown hair. She was well-liked, well-read, intelligent, and she loved her job. And then one day she went missing. She was last seen getting off a train in Marion, a northern suburb of Cedar Rapids, where she worked. It was believed that she went to Marion to see her doctor because she had been feeling poorly since the beginning of the school year. The local community searched for her for months, and her family even hired private investigators. They left no stone left unturned, followed all leads and looked for her as far as California. But Merle was never heard from again. A sad tale. And how come Harry knew all of this about Merle, yet he categorically refused to believe Mary Dufour could be her? Baker had to press for an answer, but he managed to tease out one. All this time, he had been talking to Harry Sizer, Anna Merle's younger brother. And Harry was very unwilling to change the narrative he had built for himself. There was no way he was going to believe Merle succumbed to anything other than a quick, relatively painless death as a young woman. Baker set off to Cornell College in Mount Vernon over the weekend. If he could get his hands on any clippings from fall of 1926, mentioning the details of Merle's disappearance, he could adequately rule out Merle as Mary and move on. After all, Merle had gone missing in 1926, and Mary Dufour had only turned up in 1932. A 6-year gap. It was highly unlikely that she had managed to survive out there for 6 years before she was committed. Amnesic. At Cornell, Baker spent hours and hours digging through microfilm from the Mount Vernon Hawkeye Record and Lisbon Herald, the name by which the local weekly newspaper was known by back in the day. Without any technology that would allow him to scan the documents for her name, he had to read through hundreds of slides, starting in the summer of 1926. But his efforts paid off. Harry's story checked out. On Friday, November 5, 1926, Anna Merle Sizer had gone missing. She was an elementary school teacher, and she taught 2nd and 3rd grades. She was last seen by a friend getting off a train in Marion, near Cedar Rapids. That weekend, she didn't visit home in Mount Vernon. The next Monday, she didn't show up at her job. The following Wednesday, she was possibly seen wandering along U.S. Route 30, 75 miles east of Cedar Rapids by a policeman. He didn't approach her because he didn't know about Merle's disappearance at the time. She was also supposedly seen somewhere in Wheatland and Chicago, walking around in a daze. All descriptions matched. She was wearing a green plaid coat her family recognized as Merle's. There also came a few odd reports from motel workers along Route 30, describing how a mysterious man came asking for a room for a woman who was very sick. Another witness stated that he mentioned the woman was having a mental breakdown. While not all motel workers saw the woman, at least 2 said they saw her sitting in the back of the man's car, wearing a hat, and covering her face with her hands. Merle always wore a hat. The lead seemed pretty solid. Something terrible had happened to Merle. Violent assault, most likely. She might have lost her memory as a consequence. She then proceeded to travel east in a daze, probably along Route 30, which goes from Cedar Rapids, where she was last seen, to Chicago, where her last unconfirmed sighting took place. She might have been with her perpetrator or with one or more Good Samaritans who gave her lifts and tried to help her by paying for motel rooms. It was also near Chicago that Mary Dufour had been found. But by late November 1926, Merle had not been seen again. And soon enough, the papers lost interest in her story. Thanks for watching. Did you like the video? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you next time. r/bye